Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in just a few minutes.
Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos. Vamos a estar dando inicio en solo unos minutitos.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Nous allons commencer d'ici peu. Merci.
Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Don't worry, you're not supposed to hear anything yet. Thanks for your patience. We're just waiting for more people to join.
हम अभी कुछ ही समय में शुरू करेंगे। आप अभी कुछ नहीं सुन पा रहे हैं, इससे चिंता ना करें। अभी हम इंतजार कर रहे हैं कि सब लोग जुड़ जाएंगे।
Buenos
Bonjour à
días a
tous et à
todos.
toutes. Nous allons commencer d'ici peu. Merci pour votre patience.
Muchas gracias a todos. Vamos a estar iniciando en unos minutitos.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to start with an interpretation announcement.
Buenos días a todos. Vamos a iniciar haciendo lo que es el anuncio de la interpretación.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Nous allons commencer avec une annonce en ce qui concerne l'interprétation. Merci.
Thank you. So first things first, let's discuss interpretation. The interpretation is not on yet. We're about to turn it on. And when we turn it on, you will see a small globe at the bottom of your screen. When you see that globe, click on it, and then you can choose the language you want to listen to this webinar in. You will have the choices of English, Hindi, French, and Spanish. I'm going to ask the interpreters to come in now in Hindi, French, and Spanish and repeat that announcement.
सबका स्वागत है और हम आपको बता दें कि अभी हमने अनुवाद का फंक्शन ऑन नहीं किया है, लेकिन कुछ ही समय में हम अनुवाद का फंक्शन ऑन करेंगे और आपकी स्क्रीन पे आपको एक ग्लोब का बटन दिखाई देगा। वहां से आप अपनी पसंदीदा भाषा का चुनाव कर सकते हैं। आज के वेबिनार के लिए हिंदी, फ्रेंच, स्पेनिश और अंग्रेजी में अनुवाद उपलब्ध है। तो जैसे ही ये चालू करेंगे हम लोग अनुवाद, तो आप अपनी भाषा का चुनाव करें और फिर आप अपनी भाषा में सुन पाएंगे। Thank you.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Ce webinaire va se dérouler en 4 langues, l'anglais, français, hindi et espagnol. Donc, merci de vous diriger au bas de votre écran. Vous allez voir une petite icône de globe. Et sur cela, vous pouvez appuyer et sélectionner votre langue de préférence. Merci. Thank you.
Buenos días a todos. Cuando iniciemos el proceso de la interpretación simultánea, ustedes van a ver en la parte de abajo el icono y ahí van a poder seleccionar uno de los 4 idiomas. Vamos a tener disponibles español, francés, inglés e hindú. Así que pueden seleccionarlo y a partir de ahí podrán escuchar el idioma de su preferencia. Gracias.
Okay, the interpretation is on. So please select your language, and now we're going to begin. Thanks, everyone. On behalf of the Child Early and Forced Marriage and Unions and Sexuality Working Group, welcome. I'm Sarah Green. I'm with American Jewish World Service. We're a grant-making and advocacy organization, and we fund grassroots organizations and social movements working on human rights issues in 16 different countries. Today, the working group is here with some of our collaborating organizations, and we're excited to launch our new conceptual framework on child marriage and girl sexuality. This initiative has been a long time coming. Over 2 years ago, we convened at the Ford Foundation with many colleagues in the field, and we asked, what do we need to do to generate more and better funding, better support for this issue, for addressing control of girl sexuality as an under-addressed driver of child marriage? One of the answers that we got was that a clear and coherent framework that demonstrates the linkages between control of sexuality and child marriage and what interventions can be used to address those linkages would be a contribution towards more effective advocacy on this issue, meaning advocacy within and towards funding institutions and among other stakeholders who are in a position to provide resources to address this issue, which has been rather taboo in child marriage work. The conceptual framework could also support program development for implementing organizations wanting to tackle this issue. So we were just getting ready to embark on this project when COVID hit, and that obviously destabilized everything, and attention was needed to the acute crisis, including for the ways it was impacting women and girls. We consulted our members, do we really need to move forward with this conceptual framework project at this time? Is this really what's needed? And the answer we got was a very certain yes. Because the control of women's and girls' bodies and sexuality, and control of the bodies and sexuality of queer and gender nonconforming people, especially young people, was certainly not going to go away during the public health emergency. And this is at the root of so many sexual and reproductive rights violations. Child marriage, yes, but also FGM, also gender-based violence, also moving backwards in time and taking away the right to safe and legal abortion. These are all, each one, manifestations of how patriarchal norms aim to control our bodies and our lives, and they will always have the most severe consequences for those experiencing different forms of marginalization through poverty, through racism, etc. So, knowing this piece would be evergreen, we decided to move forward. We'll be using our time together today to have some of the working group members walk you through the highlights of what's in the framework, including what funders can do to better support this work. And we'll hope it'll just be an inspiration for you to go on and read the framework, which is currently available in English, French, and Spanish, and pretty soon available in Hindi too. After the presentation, we'll hear some reflections from our friend Kathleen Flynn Dapa from Global Affairs Canada and then we'll turn to the audience questions. So please keep putting your questions in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can later in the hour. And if you're inclined to use social media to get the messages out, we're putting the Twitter handles from the various speaker organizations in the chat now. And just a gentle reminder to all of our speakers, please go slow so our interpreters can convey your messages as clearly as possible. And so without further ado, I'm so happy to turn this over to Anne Sprinkle of CARE, who is my co-chair in the Sexuality Working Group. Thanks, Anne, and thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Anne Sprinkle. I'm the project director for the Tipping Point Initiative. So I work with CARE USA's Gender Justice team. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited for everyone to be here to share with us this work that we've been working on for over 2 years. So to give you a little bit of background, in 2019, the Sexuality Working Group published Tackling the Taboo, which rounded up the experiences of a few dozen organizations around the world working at the intersection of sexuality and child marriage. Now, alongside some collaborating organizations and with consultants from the Torchlight Collective, we have developed the conceptual framework out of an express need, like Sarah said, by funders and other stakeholders for a clear articulation of how control of adolescent sexuality drives CEFMU and what interventions can address this. This is a conceptual framework, meaning its job is to present the elements of this problem and the solutions and how they all relate. It is not a summary of evidence or a systematic review. It is based on evidence and experience, including consultations with adolescent girls in India, Niger, Guatemala, and practitioners working with adolescent girls, and then finally a consultation with bilateral and foundation donors as well. So the inputs from all of these stakeholders are reflected in this resource. So this is the graphic that accompanies the 40-page narrative of the framework. This is a lot to take in as a graphic. There's a lot of richness and explanation that our presenters are going to walk you through in lots of ways that the conceptual framework is directly applicable to your work. So for instance, at different stages of the project cycle. And I want to recognize that people on the line have a lot of experiencing these issues. So we're excited for your questions and your comments today, in addition to the lived experiences of girls and practitioners that are at the heart of the conceptual framework. So we're excited to share in all of that with you. As each presenter goes over the components of the framework today, their slides are also going to highlight quotes directly from our consultations, so don't miss those on the slides as well. All right, so let's take a look at the framework. The framework itself sets out an envisioned change, which is an amalgamation of all the different changes girls told us they wanted to see. It's represented by the sunburst near the top of the image. Now take a look at the left part of the graphic, the purple part on root causes. To achieve this vision of a bright future, we need to understand the root causes of CEFMU as they relate to the control of girl sexuality, which is an underaddressed issue, to see why CEFMU persists despite so many efforts to end it. Now we move on to deconstructing and transforming. That's the drill, busting up those root causes. And it shows how programming and advocacy can disrupt these norms and structures and move towards the envisioned change. Alongside gender transformative approaches, we'll talk about the principles that make those approaches effective and the change makers we engage through them. Everyone potentially has a role, but maybe not everyone does. Eugenia will talk us through the relationship surrounding and impacting girls' lives a bit. Finally, Lakshmi is going to present some of the recommendations. We have recommendations for multiple groups, including researchers and practitioners, but we're going to focus on funders today during our webinar. So let's get started with some of these sections. I'm going to pass it to Aida from the Global Fund for Women to show us what that bright future looks like.
Hi, my name is Aida Kimascriva, and I'm Program Officer for Adolescent Girls' Rights at Global Fund for Women. Thank you for joining us today. I'll be taking you over through the envisioned change. Next slide, please. The narrative starts with envision change in order to ground the framework in the desired feminist reality that girls and young women hope to experience in their lives. The overarching vision is for a world where girls exert agency over their bodies and lives, including whether, to whom, and when to marry, and how to express their sexuality. Girls in all their diversity are able and feel supported to express their sexuality inside and outside of marriage, and to freely develop life intentions and aspirations, including in relation to marriage and children. We see the envision change represented across 4 levels: individual, relationship, community, and societal levels. As girls are not present on this panel, I would like to read out some of the girls' quotes to bring their voices to the space. The quotes and their analysis are from consultation with girls to highlight their hopes and dreams and make the link with their lived experience. Please come on this journey with us and dream. Next slide, please. India's Girls Focus Group says, in my dream world, every girl knows about their body. They can take decisions for themselves and can decide who they want to have sex with. On the individual level of envision change, girls want to feel positively about their sexuality, have information to make decisions, enjoy equitable relationships, and decide if, when, and whom to marry. LGBTQI and gender nonconforming young people are desiring support to express, enjoy their identity and sexuality. Girls want to be free, safe to wear what they want, go where they want, and voice their opinions. Next slide, please. During the consultations, Niger Girls Focus Groups expressed, girls desire more open conversations with parents about their dating. Girls are hoping there will not be discrimination in the attitudes, behaviors of their parents towards them and their brothers. This and other quotes showcase that on the relationship level, girls want parents to understand adolescent SRHR and know how to be supportive of adolescent girls' desires and dreams while modeling equitable relationships. And boys need to engage in understanding the SRHR of girls and be supportive of equitable relationship across genders. On a peer level, adolescent girls want to have a community to support each other's desires and dreams. Next slide, please. The envision change on the community level includes changes of norms in the institutions, starting from schools, health services providing SRHR info and services to all girls, especially unmarried girls. Girls need to be respected as complete human beings with equal rights and potential beyond marriage and motherhood. Institutions see girls as rights bearers rather than economic burden or extractive source of income and address all forms of gender-based violence in survivor-centered ways. The envision change on the community level ensures changes of norms that are supportive of girls' sexuality, and girls are not shamed. To quote Guatemala Girls Focus Group, where the community cares about my rights and supports my dreams, where they give priority to my dreams no matter how ridiculous they are, where they give us comprehensive education, where we are not singled out, where we are cared for and educated, where they take care of us and protect our rights and support our studies instead of marriages. Teachers and service providers care about and address the specific and priority needs of girls, adolescents, and young women. Next slide, please. The envision change from individual to relationship to community levels lead to changes on societal level. The envision change on the societal level includes changes in power structures, institutions, and service providers to no longer uphold inequitable gender norms. The future where laws and institutions support all consensual, sexual, and effective relationship between adolescents, including relationship outside of marriage, where survivor-centered services are available, and violence against women and girls viewed as unacceptable, where girl-friendly services across health, education, etc., support girls' body autonomy and choices. I would like to offer last quote to reflect on envision changes before Jackie from Girls Not Brides will discuss the societal and gender norms at the root of CFMU. Girls from Guatemala envision a future where institutions provide quality, comprehensive sexuality education in all the spaces where we develop and also provide the necessary tools for us to know our sexuality in a responsible way, as if it were normal. We hope that as girls and adolescents, they listen to us. Most of the time, men are treated better by the laws. They don't give importance to this kind of issues. We want them to listen to us. Now, Jackie, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Ada. That was great. On to the next slide, please. So we're going to look at what stands between girls and these changes that they themselves want to see in their lives that were so well illustrated there. We know that child marriage is driven by gender inequality and poverty and girls' lack of access to quality education and limited female labour opportunities. And we know that underpinning all of these are discriminatory norms that severely restrict girls' choices, voice, and agency, and put them at risk of child marriage and mean that they're not leading the lives that they want to lead. So we're going to zoom in on the graphic on these circles that relate to the norms. I'm going to talk about the norms, and Valerie is going to talk about the structures, the norms that relate to fear and control of girls' sexuality. As we've heard, the largely unaddressed and yet hugely powerful root causes of child marriage. A dotted line shows the larger circle is connected below the surface to this smaller circle where we read child marriage programming that does not center and support girls' sexuality. And this is just to show us again that unless we address these discriminatory norms and structures related to gender and sexuality, child marriage and many other forms of gender inequality will continue, and the girls will not experience or lead the lives they want to lead. So we're showing this below the surface, partly because they're often invisible. You can't see them, but boy, do girls feel them. And we're showing that they're very powerful. So a quick recap of what we mean by norms. So the framework's definition builds on work done by Chislage, Heiss, Pulwitz, and others. Social norms, we know, are a shared set of informal rules that define what's acceptable and appropriate behavior. And a subset, the gender norms, relate to how people of different genders should behave. They're maintained and perpetuated by a system of rewards and sanctions that are reproduced through our relationships, embedded in formal and informal institutions, as well as in our hearts and minds. And they shape girls' unequal access to resources, to power, and influence our core sense of self. We know norms influence who has decision-making power, even in the most intimate of our life areas, including our sexuality, who to have sex with, whether to have children, who we can marry, when, and even if we want to. They're influenced by social and political systems, and so understanding context is crucial. But as we see here, metanorms, patriarchy, social hierarchy, and adultism can be found across contexts all over the world. Very briefly, social hierarchy relates to some people having more power than others because of a set of socially constructed norms that create privilege or discrimination. Patriarchy, as we know, relates to the privileges connected with being male and the discrimination of being female, in inverted commas. Adultism relates to the privileges connected with being an adult and the discrimination experienced by children and young people, which means that they, and especially young girls, are expected to obey their elders, set aside their own agency and their own life dreams. Next slide, please. The framework clusters the norms related to fear and control of girls' sexuality and child marriage into 5 main groups, and there are strong interdependencies between all of them. In these first 2 groups, we're looking at norms related strongly to the high value placed on girls' virginity and the strict codes of conduct and severe sanctions, including murder, for transgressions. As we heard in the India Girls Focus Group, and I quote, "Girls in our community would have to face violence from their parents and families if she had sex or got pregnant outside of marriage. Most likely it will result in honor killing, where the girl will be killed, and subsequently their parents will commit suicide out of shame. Girls who have or are suspected of having sex before marriage are considered a disgrace to themselves and their family. And this fear of loss of family honor through real or rumored premarital sex, pregnancy, or expressions of sexual autonomy are among the most often cited reasons given by parents for marrying girls before the age of 18. Adolescence is the time of peak fear and control by a girl's parents, at the same time as when girls and boys are experiencing the need for greater intimacy, autonomy, and to express their emerging sexuality, which means adolescence is the time of a perfect storm when girls experience heightened and multiple restrictions on their mobility, access to digital technology, freedom to mix with boys, be in public spaces, or even to go to school. Norms around protection and family responsibility mean that in many places, marriage is considered the only place where girls and family honor can be safeguarded from rumors of impurity or from sexual violence. Fear and control of girls' choices around sexuality and marriage are justified as protection, and yet we know that girls married before 18 are some of those most affected by intimate partner violence. Next slide, please. In the third and fourth groups, motherhood and adulthood and heteronormativity and marriage, again, which have strong links with the other groups, we have to remember that it's not every girl's dream to marry, and it's not every girl's dream to marry a man. Societal norms equate heteronormative marriage and motherhood with status. Gendered stereotypes of girls as homemakers, mothers, and carers compromise their access and enjoyment of the same opportunities as their brothers or husbands, and can blinker their own aspirations. Girls who go against the dominant norms, choosing not to marry, to form same-sex relationships, or to leave a marriage, face multiple sanctions, including risk of violence, but also social and economic exclusion. As we heard from the Guatemala Girls Group, in my community, they are very traditional or conservative. They would not react well to girls who express or are suspected of attraction to other girls. They would mark it as a dishonor to the family. It's sad because there are families that force them to marry not a person they like or love. They marry them for goods or because the family doesn't have money. They sell the girls, and the parents would react badly if the girl or teenager does not want to marry. Next slide, please. In this final group, we're looking at gender norms that equate all boys with sexual predators, which means that girls and boys are prevented from spending unsupervised time together once they reach adolescence. These norms also mean that girls and their families, and not the perpetrators, are blamed for sexual violence, as they are the ones held responsible for maintaining a girl's virginity. These norms related to sexual violence and harassment and purity and family honor explain why sexual violence the world over is massively underreported, and why there are marry your rapist laws in more than 20 countries. Quoting from the Guatemala Girls Focus Group, "One time my mother told me not to wear my school skirt because I could be raped. Why, if I'm going out with my school uniform?" So to conclude, these norms create societal pressures for girls to be married and can cost them their education, health, physical freedom, livelihood, friendships, and even their lives. They're really powerful. And we're going to hear now from Valerie from Korea how these norms are embedded in structures which serve to perpetuate the vicious cycle of oppression that needs to be broken for girls to step into their power and equal rights and choose the lives they want to lead. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Aida, for sharing girls' experiences and setting the context for what I'm going to share. Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie, and I work as a manager programs in Korea. As shared by Jackie, norms embedded in culture control lives of young girls. What add to this control are structures. Exclusionary in nature, these structures work to reinforce norms, perpetuating more harm to young people and contribute in reproducing unequal power structures. In the coming slides, we shall go through how these structures function and exercise power through law and policies, education, health, and economic opportunities. Next slide, please. Next slide. The legal ecosystem comprises range of protectionist law, having a direct implication on the right of young people to exercise their sexuality. For example, the current laws framed around minimum age of consent in India fail to recognize the biological and social realities of young people and their evolving capacities. POCSO Act in India, referred as Protection of Children from Sexual Offense, 2012, made to protect children from sexual crimes, is often used against young people in consensual romantic relationships. The law makes no distinction and have devastating effect in practice. This makes me further emphasize on not only that this is a violation of right, but how these laws are punitive and push young people to hide their relationships and adopt unsafe sexual practices, increasing the chances of getting STIs and other fatal infections. Next slide, please. Similar to law and policies, education structure wields control in similar ways. Girls are less likely to continue with their education compared to boys. The overprotectionist approach of parents restricts girls to pursue their education, especially if it requires them to go outside their communities. The social and cultural norms and practices, accompanied by the poor socio-economic structures and poor school infrastructure, add to the barriers and impede girls' access to education and other opportunities. Comprehensive sexuality education has been a crucial opportunity within educational setting in transforming these gender norms and building capacity of girls to make decisions about their lives. Yet, in many countries, it has still not been institutionalized. Next slide. The paternalistic and patriarchal behavior of health service provider is another major obstacle. It permeates more harm to young people who often face discrimination of being judged in accessing SRH information and services like safe abortion. This has often pushed them to adopt unsafe sexual practices, leading to STIs, unwanted pregnancies, and even going for unsafe abortion. In many countries, access to sexual and reproductive health services are dependent on the marital status of women. Many countries continue to ban abortion by legislating it. This makes us question who then can and cannot access the health services without being fearful or being punished or judged by service provider, boiling down to who does then these structures protect. In a country like India, a young girl less than an age of 18 years, married, will be able to access abortion in a private or a public hospital compared to an unmarried girl of the same age. Next slide. Gender social norms often confine girls to domestic spaces. They drop out from school in unpaid to support unpaid care work, giving zero opportunities to financial independence. From the perceived risk of sexual violence, parents often control girls, restricting their mobility in the name of protecting them. The experiences of young women and girls at the time of COVID clearly shows us how there is a lack of access to digital technology and how these girls are under constant surveillance, compounding to limited access to information and any form of remote learning. I thereby finish my slides, and I'll just hand it over to Deepshikha to discuss more about gender transformative approaches, which are strategies which can be adopted by many nonprofits, practitioners, and funders to move towards this envisioned change. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for taking us through the structural root causes. And now we will be moving on to our discussion about gender transformative approaches, or GTA, to address and challenge those root causes. Yeah. So how can we deconstruct and transform the harmful norms and structures that control girls' sexuality and drive child early forced marriage and unions to move towards a more just and equitable, a gender equitable world? Of course, this requires gender transformative approaches that support girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights and challenge the norms and institutions that perpetrate the same. To make these gender transformative approach effective, it is also important to follow programmatic principles, program principles, and engage with change makers across all levels of the socioeconomic framework. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the gender transformative approaches aim to achieve gender equality by encouraging a critical awareness of gender norms and addressing the unequal power relations and distribution of resources between women and girls and others in the community. This is done through the following things: building building gender consciousness by fostering critical examination of inequalities and redefining rigid gender norms. It must also be with an awareness of diversity and due consideration of intersectional factors. For example, I am a cis heteronormative, I'm a cis het upper caste woman from urban India, and therefore I hold certain privileges. A gender transformative approach that caters to people like me should speak to our lived experiences. Addressing unequal power relations and seeking to redistribute power and decision making over all matters of sexuality. So, girls and women lead as agents of change and not just passive actors or beneficiaries, while men and boys are enabled to contribute to achieving gender equality and the goals and objectives of the women's rights movement. Recognizing and strengthening positive norms is another way to do this. Promoting the relative position of women, girls, and marginalized groups. So there's an inclusion of gender non-conforming people and a moving away from binary approaches. Transforming the underlying social structures, policies, and broadly held social norms that perpetuate gender inequalities. And ultimately, promoting collective ownership and agency with regards to bodies and rights. Next slide, please. Now, all child early forced marriage and union programming inherently involves some approach to gender, whether it reinforces existing norms or seeks to transform them. Programming can be categorized along this continuum, which is shown on the slide here, of gender integration approaches to assess its potential impact and adjust accordingly. So should a child early forced marriage union programming fall closer to gender blind than gender formative on the continuum? It would most definitely have limitations and unintended consequences. Primarily, their aim would be not to transform gender norms to address the root causes of CEFMU, especially with regard to sexuality. For instance, let's say an organization takes a call to impart a sex education program that provides purely biological information in sex separated settings and only promotes abstinence in order to evade backlash. One might argue that given that the aim is to be culturally sensitive, this could be the only inroad to foster conversations around sex, sexuality, and safety. However, an unintended consequence of this might be that this may further stigmatize adolescent girls who choose to be sexually active. It can lead to unplanned pregnancies, sexually transmitted infections, and as a result, potentially unwanted marriages and unions, and to girls eventually dropping out of school. Alternatively, if the organization were to work with the various stakeholders of the communities of intervention, such as parents, educators, community and religious leaders, to tackle their resistance against a rights-based and pleasure-centric program, work long-term on shifting perspective and actively actively involving and building the leadership of young people in advocacy endeavors, it would prove to be closer to a gender transformative approach. I'll now bring in Eugenia from the International Planned Parenthood Foundation to tell us more about the guiding principles for gender transformative approaches and the change makers involved in them. Over to you, Eugenia.
Thank you. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Sin duda, el contenido de las presentaciones anteriores nos plantea otras preguntas respecto a cómo y con quiénes tenemos que trabajar para provocar cambios significativos en la vida de las niñas y las adolescentes y transformar así... disculpen, no había prendido mi video. Y transformar las estructuras que sostienen los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas y el control de la sexualidad. Es importante que hablemos de principios rectores de programas y de personas provocadoras de cambio, porque estos ayudarán a que los programas que diseñemos, midamos o financiemos provoquen transformaciones positivas en la vida de las niñas adolescentes, especialmente si queremos buscar que estos cambios se sostengan en el tiempo y que se adecúen a las necesidades y contextos particulares de las comunidades con las que trabajamos. Next slide, please. Vamos a comenzar por los principios rectores que son básicos para el diseño de programas que tacleen las estructuras de poder y normas que sostienen los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas y el control de la sexualidad. El marco conceptual nos señala que podemos considerar 7 principios básicos. Next slide, please. El primero, y hemos estado hablando de esto desde el inicio, es centrar las voces, las necesidades y las aspiraciones de las niñas adolescentes en el centro. Ellas deben ocupar un lugar esencial a modo que podamos maximizar los beneficios de un programa para ellas. Me gusta mucho la frase que destaca el marco conceptual que dice, hay que permitir que las niñas sean las protagonistas de su propio proceso. Y por ello les quiero decir que es importante que realicemos ejercicios de escucha y de consulta constante, para que no perdamos esa perspectiva tan valiosa. El segundo principio es diseñar programas multicomponentes y multinivel. Esto quiere decir que los programas no deben centrarse en un solo actor o una sola necesidad al momento de abordar los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas o el control de la sexualidad. Las niñas y adolescentes son personas integrales, con vidas y círculos sociales complejos. Las implementadoras de programas debemos tener una mirada amplia que logre movilizar apoyo dentro de las comunidades de las niñas y que logre reconocer las necesidades subyacentes que pueden provocar estas prácticas nocivas. Next slide, please. Next slide. En tercer lugar, tenemos la interseccionalidad. El marco nos indica la importancia de comprender la intersección de opresiones a las que se enfrentan las niñas para ofrecer un mejor acceso a servicios o facilitar un entorno desde el que pueda florecer su agencia. A veces nos olvidamos de que ellas también son personas que pertenecen a más de una comunidad o grupo, como de la diversidad sexual o una comunidad indígena, por ejemplo. Y pasar por alto estas características puede ser crucial al momento de entender las necesidades particulares que pueden tener. También necesitamos que los programas estén basados en el diálogo y en la reflexión sobre las normas de género. Estos diálogos son tanto con las niñas como con el personal del programa y están dirigidos a digerir los conceptos que creemos saber sobre la agencia, el sexo, los roles de género y la autonomía de las personas. Los diálogos deben estar adaptados a los públicos con los que trabajamos. Otro de los principios es que los programas estén diferenciados por la edad de sus participantes, a modo de reconocer las capacidades evolutivas que tienen las niñas, adolescentes y miembros de la comunidad según su edad y etapa de vida. Otro principio es que los programas sean impulsados por la comunidad, desde un deseo por el cambio estructural. En ese sentido, podemos aliarnos con movimientos feministas, de pueblos indígenas o de mujeres para construir sobre sus peticiones y amplificarlas con otros tomadores de decisiones a nivel nacional, regional o global. Y finalmente, los programas deben estar contextualizados en las comunidades. Debemos invertir ese tiempo y espacio para desarrollar una comprensión compartida de los orígenes y la motivación particular de ciertas prácticas, como son los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas, o el control de la sexualidad, para provocar el cambio que queremos ver en nuestra comunidad. Next slide, please. El marco conceptual utiliza una perspectiva ecológica, lo que quiere decir que toma en consideración y recomienda trabajar con el entorno social de las niñas y adolescentes para potenciar cambios positivos en sus vidas. Lo que recomienda el documento es considerar a los provocadores de cambio en múltiples niveles. El individual, pensando en las niñas, adolescentes y jóvenes diversas y o casadas. El relacional, que es en donde encontramos padres, hermanos, pares, niños y jóvenes. El comunitario, que es en donde están líderes comunitarios, docentes, prestadores de servicios. Y finalmente el de la sociedad, en donde vamos a ver movimientos feministas, a las políticas, a los gobernantes, celebridades, líderes de opinión, etc. Next slide, please. Ahora, ¿cómo podemos usar estos principios y esta perspectiva ecológica? Pues primero considerando que son principios que tienen el propósito de guiar nuestras intervenciones y programas. Es fundamental que los tengamos en vista en cada etapa de la implementación. Por ejemplo, entender la integralidad de las niñas y las necesidades subyacentes de una comunidad para poder diseñar un programa y luego entender los resultados que captamos de ello. Tener ejercicios constantes de escucha nos ayuda a tener un diseño flexible al contexto donde trabajamos. La participación significativa de niñas, adolescentes y jóvenes en los espacios de gobernanza y consulta de nuestras propias organizaciones es muy importante porque les da una plataforma para expresar sus preguntas, ideas y comentarios, además de que les permite participar en votaciones y tomar decisiones sobre lo que hagamos. Next slide, please. No, perdón. Sorry, no, that's. Y finalmente quiero resaltar lo que nos dijeron las niñas de Nigeria cuando estaban construyendo este marco conceptual. Cuando los programas son administrados e incluyen a personas de la comunidad, son más conscientes de sus dificultades y sus necesidades específicas. Le paso de nuevo la palabra a Deepshika de la Youth P Foundation.
Thank you, Ahenia. Thank you for making it easier for me to present an example of a gender transformative approach in the context of our work at the YP Foundation. The YP Foundation is a youth-led organization that facilitates young people's feminist and rights-based leadership on issues of health equity, gender justice, sexuality rights, and social justice. The YP Foundation ensures that young people have the information, capacity, and opportunities to inform and lead the development and implementation of programs and policies that impact their lives and are recognized as skilled and aware leaders of change. For us at the YP Foundation, it is imperative to apply the tenets of gender transformative approach by addressing our own individual and organizational journey in fostering critical thinking around inequality, gender roles, norms, and power dynamics. Our own social location and lived realities become an important vantage point to understanding gender, and therefore it is imperative and important for us to center the lived realities of people we work with, especially young people from gender minority communities. For example, young people and adolescent girls play a central role in influencing the content and design of our implementation plans. These plans also take into account the context of the community that forms their ecosystem. The intended impact of our engagement with adolescent girls in one of our programs, namely the Butterfly Project that you can see on your screen, is to build their feminist leadership. And the capacity building sessions that we are currently facilitating with them are on building their skills to navigate the digital spaces. This need was identified by the adolescent girls group themselves in the context of shifting digital needs exacerbated by COVID and the compulsory online classes in schools and colleges. So these sessions are planned to address the requirement of theirs to navigate such spaces, while also building their understanding around gender, power, and the societal structures that can normalize identity-based discriminations and not be cognizant of different experiences of people based on their social location. Similarly, the program Know Your Body, Know Your Rights works to empower adolescents and youth across the country by delivering stigma-free and rights-affirming information on issues of health, sexuality, and human rights. The program builds young people's and adolescents' capacity to advocate for their health and well-being on a personal, community, state, and national levels. One of the strategies is to make the comprehensive sexuality education curriculum designed by the YP Foundation accessible and available to young people across schools and communities. While the curriculum and the workshops take into account the evolving capacities of different age groups. It is designed to break the stigma and taboos and provide pleasure affirming and rights based information to adolescents. This information, made available to young people in a non threatening manner, provides them with the tools and knowledge to negotiate around issues like choice, consent, decision making, bodily autonomy, and sexuality with key stakeholders such as family members, community members, and policymakers. These two programs, in addition to all other programs at the YP Foundation, speak to each other and draw from the experiences of participants as well as teammates to inform as well as function as a checklist in inculcating the principles of gender transformative approach. We strongly believe that this approach will shift the focus on the lived realities of individuals and on addressing the root causes of child early forced marriage and unions and expand the narrative to include and foreground the overarching vision of a world where adolescents and young people from gender minority groups assert agency over their bodies and lives, including whether, to whom, and when to marry and how to express their sexuality. To put all of this into action, Lakshmi from the Girls First Fund will provide recommendations for the funders.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lakshmi Moore, and I'm with the Girls First Fund. Before I start, I would like to sort of reiterate that the framework report covers recommendations for funders and practitioners. For today's conversation, I'll be focusing on funders. Next slide, please. One of the first things we are asking funders to look into for themselves and their partners is to invest in ongoing capacity building. This is particularly around gender transformative approaches that address control over girls' sexuality as a root cause of CEFMU, and also supporting in creating meaningful spaces for practitioners to be able to reflect on sexuality and to strengthen their work. Often many organizations, especially small organizations, do not have the resources they need to be able to learn and grow. And they will need the funding to support their staffing, to support their training, and to support their learning. Next slide, please. We're also asking funders to look into investing in girl-led and feminist movements and organizations. This is about trusting and supporting women and youth organizations that intrinsically gets it, and about fostering partnership between thought leaders and other organizations. We want funders to also recognize that organizations will need some time with the capacity building to learn and adapt and experiment these principles, especially to the local context, and that's okay. This is why partnering with feminist movements that are already at the front line, that already get this work, is important to be able to effectively address CEFMU. And it means providing longer-term flexible funding that correspond to recognizing that social change itself is not a linear process. Next slide, please. We're also asking funders to look into addressing structural causes, structural drivers of gender and harmful gender and social norms. This means avoiding cherry picking, cutting corners, or using the terminology and not the approach, and looking at making sure that programming across legal, education, workforce, and health institutions are safe, accessible, and girl-friendly. This also means avoiding funding standalone interventions that do not address gender change. For instance, organizations that will do work around providing cash incentives for parents, but do not address girls' sexual and reproductive health rights. It also means recognizing that gender transformative programming has to be able to address the structural causes of CEFMU that move the conversation and programming towards addressing girls' sexuality in a way that can change harmful gender and social norms and the institutions that uphold it. Next slide, please. We are also asking funders and their partners to avoid silo programming. It's important to reconsider championing programming that promotes approaches between sectors and not just focus on one sector. And at the same time, recognize that when you fund siloed approaches, it only addresses the symptom of a larger problem of the inequitable gender norms and not the root causes. Addressing CEFMU requires a holistic, multi-sectoral, and multi-component approach. This means that funders should be able to recognize that sometimes even with capacity building and investment, one organization cannot do it all. As such, fostering collaborations with multiple organizations and providing funding to multiple complementary organizations at the community level can ensure that we are effectively tackling CEFMU. Next slide. And lastly, and this is something that we know is quite important in terms of monitor and evaluation approaches that center girls' voices. It is important that funders are able to identify and understand measures of success for gender transformative CEFMU programming that can capture change beyond the age of marriage. It's also important that funders look at articulating monitor and evaluation approaches that can center girls' voices and define success from their perspective. In this framework, we've already shared some of from the girls' perspective, some of what they envision change would mean. So this means investing in theory of change and evaluation framework that are developed by girls, that support girls from the planning of the monitor and evaluation framework to even understanding the indicators and fostering the opportunity and platform for girls to be able to share their understanding of what change means and the learnings between feminist networks and organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. I'm really excited to introduce Kathleen Flynn Dappa, Director of Education, Gender-Based Violence and Child Protection at Global Affairs Canada. Kathleen and GAC more broadly have been really valued collaborators to the working group for the last few years as this conceptual framework has come into being, including as a participant in our donor consultation last year. Lakshmi just talked directly to funders, so now we're going to hear from a donor, one that doesn't just have a substantive commitment to ending child marriage, but also demonstrates feminist foreign policy more broadly. So really excited to hear your reflections about what we just presented, Kathleen, so please take it away.
Thank you, Anne. And I just want to say how much I appreciate the invitation to join you and these fellow presenters, the members of the working group on CFMU and sexuality for today's webinar. It's a real privilege, and it's honestly really inspiring to be a part of this work. And I know the members of my team who have been engaging over the years have been so passionate about the work that this group is doing. And to be working with these partners who are advocating for, investing in, and designing and implementing what I think are truly more effective and sustainable programs to prevent child, early and forced marriage and unions, and to support women and girls who are already married. So while preventing CFMU is a priority for Canada's international assistance, we are thankfully joined by many, many other change makers, including those with us today from across the globe, many working in some small organizations grounded in the everyday realities of this, and all of whom are working to address these deeply, deeply entrenched norms and structures that are keeping girls from accessing, sometimes even knowing their rights. So the launch of this conceptual framework on CFMU and sexuality is truly an important tool to help us understand and adopt a gender transformative approach that tackles these harmful social norms and structures that perpetuate a fear and control of girls' sexuality. And I think the world that's envisioned by the girls and articulated in the first section of the framework is the ideal. And I'll speak about one quote from a girl who was speaking about the stigma for those who work outside the home. And she said, "But in the world of my dreams, the community is supportive of girls and gives them freedom." And that ideal world shared by girls in this conceptual framework and in this quote is no different than what we've heard time and again from girls in young world. They want a world where their basic human rights are respected and upheld, and where they have the support and the opportunity to develop to their full potential. The ideal world continues to be the compass that guides most of us in our work. And while likely we all know and advocate for the recognition of CEFMU as a violation of girls' fundamental human rights, we also know that the discriminatory norms that exist within our structures of society, our systems of law, education, health, and economy, as was shared today, are a part of this, and that adopting a gender transformative approach is the only way to create a world in which girls today can continue to dare to dream. The Feminist International Assistance Policy that guides Canada's international development and assistance programming aligns with this understanding, and that achieving gender equality is the only way to create real and lasting change. And in this way, we've invested the majority of our programming to support initiatives that address gender inequality, that target gender inequality, and include specific investments in gender transformative programs. On this particular issue of CFMU, we've invested over 120 million in targeted funding within the last decade. And we've worked with this wide variety of partners, including Girls Not Brides, UNICEF, UNFPA, Plan, Tostan, Save the Children, CARE, and many others. We have also supported a broad range of programming in other sectors such as education, in women-led initiatives, in youth engagement and participation, most recently through our Together for Learning Youth Summit, as well as through a range of programming that ensures that women and girls, including adolescents, have access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services, and that their rights are upheld. And this is key to young women accessing and exercising their rights. As you know, SRHR is a priority for our international assistance, where we have committed to spending 700 million annually on comprehensive SRHR. This includes our work on SGBV, CEFMU, and FGM in this comprehensive approach, but we're paying particular attention to issues including comprehensive sexuality education and adolescent SRHR, safe abortions, and family planning. I also, heard in the advice to funders around the support for girl-led and feminist organizations, which is a huge priority for Canada. And as you know, last year, together with the Ford Foundation, we announced at the Gender Equality Forum in Mexico, the intention to launch a global alliance for feminist movements. And as a result of work throughout the last year, this new global alliance is set to launch next month. And it will be a dedicated space to advance, strategize, and coordinate the political and financial support for feminist movements, sustaining dialogue and planning among donors and women's rights organizations and movements, focusing on the challenges to funding women's rights organizations and movements, and creating a shared and inclusive leadership model. Indeed, we can only achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we make progress in addressing gender inequality and ensure that women and girls are able to make decisions about their bodies and their futures. As Anne mentioned, Canada also advocates for policies to address CFMU. And for example, we do co-lead with Zambia a biennial resolution at the UN General Assembly. The fourth resolution, which was adopted by consensus in 2020, held our ground on past gains around gender equality, and it reflected on the impact of COVID-19 and how that was threatening so much of the progress that was being made for girls, including on CEFMU. And this fall, we will present it once again. And as always, we look forward to support from advocates around the world in moving that agenda forward. We really embrace the recommendations for funders. we continue to work toward dismantling our own silos. We work on centering the voices of the most marginalized, especially women and girls, in our work. And on practicing self-reflection and capacity building internally to better identify our own unconscious biases and foster a workplace culture that is feminist and rooted in principles of human rights and gender equality. This conceptual framework is an essential reminder and a pathway for addressing the root causes of CEFMU. And I echo the vision for change shared today. Our efforts are lost without gender transformative approaches that address the norms and structures that continue to drive CEFMU. And I acknowledge that, gender transformative approaches have quickly become accepted terminology, but this framework really holistically reminds us of the core principles necessary to embody the full meaning of these approaches in our work, and I think presented in a really accessible and practical way. I see it as a way to hold ourselves accountable to implement and fund truly transformative approaches, and that means confronting the issue of control over sexuality, especially the sexuality of girls in all their diversity and other, gender non-binary people, LGBTQI, etc. So it really is fundamental. Sexuality and ending CEFMU go hand in hand. So in that regard, I do urge all the other donors and private foundations, philanthropic organizations, and actors at all levels to consider and take ownership of the recommendations in the new conceptual framework that was launched today, to use this tool in our work to deepen and broaden the impact of what we're doing. The document is a concrete step forward in laying out how and why it is crucial to implement and fund gender transformative approaches and the roles we all play in doing this. So thank you very much. I'm just really moved and inspired by the session today and by the presentation of this conceptual framework.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was terrific. We really appreciated getting your and Global Canada Affairs insights on this and all the work that you do in support of ending child marriage and advancing the rights of women and girls. And it was also really great to get your perspective. And we actually have some questions in the chat for you about this too, and how funders, what challenges funders face in really embracing this approach. So hi again, I'm Sarah from AJWS, and a lot of you have put some really interesting questions in the Q&A already today. We've been trying to keep up with them as we go. Before we pose some specific questions to the panelists on the line, first I'd like to invite all the panelists to turn their videos on and be ready to answer some questions that I read out to us now. So don't be shy, let's all do this together. Great. There were a couple of questions that came up that we did answer, but I think they're really important, and so I would like to give voice to them now. There were a couple of questions about the ways in which control of sexuality manifests in different ways in different contexts, and pointing out that it's not going to be uniform manifestations nor uniform responses needed in each place. And we wanted to address that because that was something that the working group and the Torchlight collective who worked on this conceptual framework with us took very seriously. We did consultations in Nigeria, Guatemala, and India, as had been mentioned. And if you read the conceptual framework, although we couldn't include every last thing because there was so much richness, you do see nuance and variation across those three places with the ways different norms manifest for girls in different ways and different challenges that they face. So when you read the conceptual framework, you will see that those differences. We also, in the conceptual framework, we link to the consultation reports, which even have a fuller accounting of everything that girls told us in those consultations. So that's number one, is that you definitely see the variation across contexts. Also, we also recognize that we did consultations in 3 countries, and there are a lot more countries, and there's variation within countries. And so what we did is we included the consultation tools that the Torchlight Collective developed as a link in the conceptual framework. And that is an invitation to practitioners who want to be able to locally tailor these responses and their understanding and responses of these norms in their context to their local context. So we just want to say on behalf of the working group, we fully understand that this is, this is meant to be a global resource, but one that could be adapted for local context to adapt to the realities. So thank you for those who asked those questions, because that's something we really wanted to be able to express. I'm now going to ask a few questions to my fellow panelists here on the line, and I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but I'm going to put some questions out there, and if I don't get a hand raised, I might call on you. But Kathleen, I'm actually going to ask you a couple of questions first that came in when you were speaking. One of them is specifically about Canada, and one of them is about funders in general. And I think the funders question is great, and that's exactly the question we want to be, that we're going to be engaging with funders on. So the question to you, Kathleen, specifically was, is any of Canada's funding going to grassroots organizations in their work with adolescent girls? We know that can be the bigger the funder, the harder that can be to reach groups on the ground. So that's the first question. And then the bigger question that, Kathleen, we'd love to hear from you and any of the funders who also are on the call, would be about challenges that you face and that the funding field faces in enacting some of the recommendations that Lakshmi shared from the conceptual framework. So first, I'll turn it over to you, Kathleen. Thank you.
Great, thanks. These are great questions. I think on the first one, on funding for grassroots organizations, this is something that has been a priority for Canada since 2017. And there have been a few key initiatives where we've looked at doing this. So one is that through our Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, we have opportunities to fund smaller initiatives in countries. This is a fund that's managed by our missions, and they have done many interesting and innovative small projects and programs. But we also have two significant funds for this, and they are different and important. One is the Women's Voice and Leadership Program, and the other is the Equality Fund. And what makes these initiatives important is that they are actually not specific to any one particular issue, but rather they are about supporting women's rights organizations to advance the priorities that they identify themselves. We also fund the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women and Girls, which again also works quite a bit with grassroots. So it's an area that we're really focused on. And I think something that was a bit inspired by the creation of this global alliance is really to deepen that work even more and to create a space for practitioners and donors and women's rights organizations to really collectively advance this. Of course, Girl Snap Rides is a very important partner that we've been funding for a long time, and they work with their partners and with their national partnerships, and they're very committed to this as well. So there's quite a range on that. In terms of the challenges are many, because you do need to transform the way in which you approach things. And you were pointing even on the sort of supporting for grassroots organizations. It's true, the bigger the organization, the more your accountabilities are tied to sort of accountability to taxpayers, the more difficult it is to support some smaller organizations. But I think we've been doing a lot of work to change that, both in terms of how we operate within our terms and conditions, but also by creating these umbrella partnerships that can help us to do that. And I think the Equality Fund is a great example of that. It's a partnership outside of the Government of Canada that's meant to be sustainable over time. I think the other thing is the silos. That takes a lot of work. I was on a panel last week and someone asked me about, are donors resistant around the silos? And my answer is really no, they're not, but it's hard to do. We still have a lot of sectoral groups. Child early and forced marriage is the one area where I've seen the most unsiloed work, the most work that centers girls in that work. And I think this is something we're trying to do. I think one area where we were quite successful was with our Charlevoix funding for education, which was part of our G7 presidency. And one of the things that we wanted to do was support more gender transformative approaches. So we didn't just talk about girls' education, we talked about the barriers that prevent girls from getting an education and getting a quality education. And the result of how we framed that work was that while these are all about girls getting an education, about 22% of that funding was not coded to the education sector. It was coded to SGBV, it was coded to nutrition, it was coded to health, it was coded to these things that girls need to get to school and be successful in school and really have the education that they need and deserve. So I think that investment, and it's one where we still don't have all of the results from it yet, but I think that shift in the way we worked is a significant result, and we need to start documenting more and more, like what did it take to get there? I think in a similar way on SRHR, we've taken this comprehensive approach, and so we've included SGBV, child marriage, FGM as a part of that particular set of work. And again, it's pushing us forward. I think the next step is to understand the collective of what we're doing and how it has impact for women and girls. So paid and unpaid care, women's rights organizations, SRHR, education. That work is hard, and I think it's where we're stretching ourselves the most. But we launched that Feminist International Assistance Policy in 2017. It's only 2022, so we're just now starting to look at what we've accomplished. And in those 5 years, and everyone says, you know, even with their programming, you can't make a lot of change in 3 years. Well, it's the same with organizations, but I think we've come to a point where we can start documenting some really significant work and sharing that more broadly to a learning agenda so more can do it.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for fielding both of those like very specific and very broad questions, and for sharing Canada's experience. I think it's really helpful as we try to, you know, shift the field and shift our practices as funders and implementers to really understand, for those who have already done things, what has that process been like? What is the reality of it? Because we are calling, you know, for organizations and institutions to work differently, and we realize that you know takes a lot of like both political motivation and also practical effort to make it happen. So it's great to hear about concrete examples. The next question I'm going to ask, and Dipshik, I'm going to put you on the spot for this one, is another one that's also getting at a very practical, you know, in terms of like how this work is implemented and done. I'm going to read the question that came through about someone is interested in the recommendations about involving girls and young women in the development of theories of change, in the development of measurements and indicators for this work. And they're pointing out what, you know, how, the importance of working with girls and young women in what can sometimes be very technical NGO processes, where a certain sort of expertise or an idea of an expertise and who it might come from ends up being prioritized. And the sort of also, you know, what donors are asking for, what they want to see measured and reported on. You know, can you share any experience from the YP Foundation about how you know, manage to engage girls, young people, and communities in authentic ways, and also balancing sort of the way the field works? You know, both your experience and maybe what you would also want to see changed about the way the field works to better enable to do the work according to your vision. And thanks for starting us off. Others are welcome to come in after too and add. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for the question, and thank you to who asked this question. I think it's really, I'm going to attempt to answer it by giving examples of how I've seen this happen. So for instance, these technical needs and requirements are scary to people like me also, who are young people working in the sector, who are sort of understanding how to you know, navigate or find the balance between their passion and also sort of you know, delivering on certain processes. But in different spaces where we have been able to bring in adolescent girls and young people and sort of center their voices, be it capacity building sessions or be it youth events where the entire event is ideated, designed, and sort of facilitated by young people. I think what we realize is that uh, they have a lot to say. This is a preconceived notion that young people and adolescent girls from marginalized communities or different social locations, like they hold back and they would not be able to understand certain systems and structures that are needed. I think what we can therefore put our energies towards is simplifying those systems itself, and figure out ways in which we can involve and make sure these voices are not left behind, precisely because the systems are difficult to navigate. I mean, this example could seem very, very I don't know how this example would build into the larger question around theory of change and all the processes that have been mentioned. But a lot of girls that we work with find it difficult to say, write their thoughts. They're not fond of writing, or maybe a certain language is something which is a bit of a detriment to them. So we find that interacting with them through video notes or voice notes has been a great experience for them as well, to sort of challenge the fear that these structures bring about, and for all of us to be able to make this a more integrative and interactive processes, where we don't have to choose between either and or. We don't have to choose between letting go of our principle of it being girl-led and gender transformative, or letting go of some of the processes. I hope this helped it.
That's great, Deepshika. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who wants to come in on that question? If not, I'll move to the next one.
I can.
Thank you, Lakshmi.
So one of the things that I think is important to note is that the recommendations as they're set out does not mean that we do one versus the other. That is also important to recognize that starting with investment in capacity building or deepening the collaborations with feminist movement and providing a space for organizations themselves to learn and how to adapt this, to provide the resources that they need to experiment so that they can understand how to identify working with girls or understanding which processes, which strategies work best to be able to identify how to support and center girls in identifying the measures of success is one way to do that. And that's why in today's conversation, we're also asking donors who we know are the custodian of the M&E practices to also adapt the capacity building for themselves, for the program officers, so that they're also able to understand and recognize the need for that. So it's not one versus the other. It's hopefully a process that is a continuum for both the organizations that will be able to receive the resources to do that, and for the donors themselves who are orienting themselves around this. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Lakshmi. I have a few more questions that have come in. One I'm going to direct towards Eugenia, because it's the part of the presentation that you led, about the change makers. And one of the questions is, how does the framework address the effect of key influencers of child marriage practices, especially in informal situations? And I didn't know if you wanted to highlight anything about the roles of some of the change makers that you spoke to us about earlier.
Thank you. Well, I think that there are two items there. One is the ecosystemic approach. And this means that you, in the context that you're working, you need to identify the different layers and where the different decision makers or change makers are. Because not as we have been discussing, not all the communities are the same, and not all the leaders will have the same weight in different communities. And the second thing is that I actually would recommend to have Girls Not Rights has a document about how to work with religious leaders. And this is a guide that is very well developed because it allows you to make an assessment of the leader you want to work and what is the level of engagement that you can have with the leader. I think that this is possible not just with religious, you can use the same material for other social leaders. And it will allow you also to understand if the leader that you want to engage is going to really be a change maker, or is it going to go against the strategy that you want to address. So it is a very specific work that has to happen at the community level. We know that when a change maker is decisive and it is committed with the cause, then change will happen. And this might even be the parents speaking on behalf of what happened in their own families, no? Like, or the teachers, or it has different layers. But you need to first ensure that you are going to be committing with somebody that is going to be there for the change.
That's great, Eugenia. Thank you so much. I think we have time for two questions to be answered briefly. I'm going to ask this one, and I'm going to ask Jackie Rapila on behalf of Girls Not Brides to please reply to it. There's a good question in the chat that is about, what about programming that is aimed to address child marriage, but decides not to get into the sexuality issue and addresses other things. What would the working group's response to be to that? What are the implications or the consequences of engaging in child marriage programming that doesn't address control of girls' sexuality?
Okay, a biggie one. Okay, so the framework does a really good job. There's a really nice table that it's a long document. I really recommend people look at the table that sets out some great examples of the consequences of not addressing fear and control of girls' sexuality. And it gives some really practical examples of what that can mean. For example, criminalization, which can mean that unmarried girls and unmarried mothers no longer have access to sexual and reproductive health rights or care. And it gives many other examples. But I think, and it repeats what other panelists have already said, given the absolute need for contextual sensitivity, particularly when addressing taboos, and the absolute need never to put anybody at greater risk, the framework, as we've said, is not a menu. It is not a silver bullet. What it tries to do is it offers these prompts. And these prompts, I think, can be used in any context with any group of people at any point in time. And how the conversation evolves from those prompts. Think about this. Remember that, all of these areas, these programming principles and these gender transformative approaches woven together with an analysis of your change makers, they will support a participatory process that's inclusive, that centers girls' voices, that doesn't put anybody at risk. But it will look different in every single, as we said, even within a country, it's going to be different in different province, different group of people, if they're new to that country. So I might have gone off track a bit there, but I think it very much goes back to the support for great dialogue, great conversations, working on ourselves as individuals, as well as understanding power between individuals and structures. I'm going to stop there.
No, that's perfect, Jackie. Thank you. And I know we're at time. We have one final question that hasn't been answered, and I would really like to ask it. And, and when I opened this, I made the link between child marriage and other sexual and reproductive rights violations. And it really brings up current events in the United States. And someone actually put a question to that effect in the chat today. And so I'd like to close with addressing this question, because these issues are all interrelated. And the question that came through is, what do you think about what is happening in the USA on abortion rights? As some of you may know, the Supreme Court, a document was linked with the intention of overturning Roe v. Wade legal abortion in the US. The question is, don't you think it would aggravate the rejection that some African communities have towards abortion? What are the strategies to anticipate the hardening of these positions? And I would really like to put this question to Eugenia from International Planned Parenthood Federation, where her organizational and personal expertise could leave us with some insights on this issue. Thanks, Eugenia.
Thank you. I'm going to answer in Spanish. Bueno, creo que esta es una pregunta muy, muy importante que hemos estado teniendo toda la semana. Estamos muy preocupadas a nivel internacional y nacional con los sucesos que están pasando desde Texas. Sabemos que Oklahoma también echó para atrás y la filtración de información que se dio el día de ayer es muy grave. Creo que lo importante primero es decir que todavía no es una decisión final, que el aborto sigue siendo legal en Estados Unidos. Eso hay que dejarlo muy, muy claro. También que los estados tienen la oportunidad de codificar la sentencia a nivel estatal para que entonces no haya una reversión tan fuerte. Desde el punto de vista internacional, creo que es importante decir que no solamente, Estados Unidos tuvo una influencia muy importante, pero ahora hay influencias del sur que son mucho más poderosas y que pueden ser mucho más optimistas, ¿no? Y bueno, yo vengo de la marea verde de América Latina y creo que también la regresión en Estados Unidos puede provocar lo contrario. Puede provocar que en los países del sur haya una apertura, haya una defensa de los derechos de las mujeres y que entonces haya una resistencia que permita visibilizar el compromiso de países en África, en Asia, en América Latina que puedan dar el paso y que en Estados Unidos el gobierno tome las medidas adecuadas para ir en contra de este retroceso. Todavía están a tiempo. Sabemos que Biden hizo una expresión a favor de los derechos de las mujeres, entonces todavía podemos pararlo y es muy importante que eso no continúe. El aborto legal ha sido una demanda fundamental y un éxito de las organizaciones en Estados Unidos y bueno, nos solidarizamos con ellas desde donde estamos, pero también les recordamos que estamos resistiendo juntas.
Gracias, Eugenia. Thank you for all those reminders and for the reminder that solidarity is more important than ever. So we are here for this. Thank you very much. And an immense thank you to the fantastic panelists for joining us today, for all the prep and work you did on being able to communicate succinctly our conceptual framework and your perspective on it. Thank you so much to the wonderful interpreters who have been doing an amazing job in getting all the messages out in various languages. And thank you to the 200 plus people who joined us today on the line. It's so great that you took time out from your day. Thanks for everything in the chat and all the great questions. You will certainly be getting the link to the conceptual framework, the presentation and the recording, and we will be talking about this framework and the different things that it raises. There's so much covered in here, and we look forward to having discussions on all the different pieces of this framework with you, with practitioners, with donors, and with other advocates. So thanks for being with us today, and we look forward to being together again soon. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.